April 6, 1917. Washington, D.C. rain slicked the streets into black glass. Carriages hissed past under gas lamps. Inside the Capitol, the air was heavy with wool, sweat, and history pressing down on every shoulder. Men spoke in low voices. Some stared at the floor. Others stared at the ceiling as if waiting for judgment to descend from it. At 3:12 a.m. the roll call began. Outside, most Americans slept. They did not hear the clerk's voice echo through the chamber. They did not see the exhausted faces of senators who understood that a vote cast in this hour would send hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, toward death. Across the Atlantic, the guns had not stopped for nearly 3 years. In the mud of northern France, men drowned, standing up. In Belgium, entire villages had ceased to exist except as names on maps. The war had become a machine that consumed flesh and iron at an industrial scale. And now the machine was reaching for America. President Woodrow Wilson sat rigid, hands folded, expression carved from restraint. He had won re-election on a promise to keep the nation out of war. Now he was asking Congress to send it in. Not reluctantly, not tentatively, but with the language of crusade. The world must be made safe for democracy. If the vote failed, America would remain an observer, rich, distant, untouched. If it passed, American boys would cross an ocean into a slaughter that had already devoured Europe's youth. In Berlin, military planners watched American industry with growing dread. In London, exhausted generals dared to hope. In Paris, civilians prayed the Atlantic would become a bridge, not a moat. The tally continued. One by one, the voices answered aye, each word, another shovel of earth on the graves of men who did not yet know they were marked for burial. When the final count came, the chamber did not erupt. There was no celebration, only a silence so deep it felt physical. War. Within 18 months, the conflict would end. Empires would collapse, borders would be redrawn. 20 million people would be dead, and the seeds of an even more catastrophic war would already be planted. But in that moment, one question lingered in the minds of those who understood what had just happened. Could America arrive in time to matter or only in time to die? This is the story of World War I. America enters in 1917, war ends in 1918. By 1917, Europe was no longer at war in the traditional sense, it was bleeding out. What began in 1914 as a contest of maneuver had hardened into a continental stalemate. From the North Sea to Switzerland stretched a jagged scar of trenches, barbed wire, and cratered earth. Generals on both sides had promised victory through decisive offensives. Instead, they produced Verdun, the some-Ypres names that became synonymous with annihilation. The British Empire had mobilized manpower from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Africa, an imperial army drawn from half the globe. France had committed nearly an entire generation of young men. Germany fought with industrial efficiency and ruthless discipline, but its resources were finite. Russia, vast but fragile, was cracking under the strain. Economically, the war had become a siege. Britain's naval blockade strangled German imports, cutting off food and raw materials. German civilians faced hunger winters. Malnutrition spread through cities once known for prosperity. In response, Germany turned to the one weapon that could bypass the blockade: the submarine. Unrestricted submarine warfare meant sinking any ship approaching enemy ports, military or civilian, neutral or not. It was a blunt instrument, and it risked provoking the one power Germany had hoped to keep neutral: the United States. America had prospered during the war. Its factories ran at full capacity, supplying the Allies with food, weapons, ammunition, steel. Wall Street loans tied American financial stability to Allied survival. Yet public opinion remained deeply divided. Many citizens saw the conflict as a European catastrophe best avoided. Others believed American honor demanded intervention against German aggression. Wilson attempted neutrality, but neutrality became impossible in a world where oceans no longer guaranteed safety. German U-boats sank American merchant ships. The Lusitania disaster in 1915, though not yet decisive, had already revealed how vulnerable civilians were on modern seas. Then came the telegram. Intercepted by British intelligence, the message from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann proposed a military alliance with Mexico if the United States entered the war. In exchange, Mexico would regain territories lost decades earlier: Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. When the contents became public, outrage surged across America. The idea of foreign powers conspiring to redraw American borders ignited a deep, visceral anger. Simultaneously, Russia, one of the Allies, collapsed into revolution. The Tsar abdicated. For Wilson, this transformed the moral equation. The Allied coalition was no longer fighting alongside an autocratic empire, but could now be framed as a defense of democracy against militaristic authoritarianism. War no longer appeared as European chaos. It became a global ideological struggle, and America's industrial power, untouched homeland, and vast manpower pools suddenly looked less like isolation and more like decisive advantage. The leaders who would determine the outcome of this conflict were not uniform in temperament, competence, or vision. Each carried personal histories that shaped how they perceived war, victory, and sacrifice. Woodrow Wilson was an academic turned politician. Steeped in moral philosophy, he believed in principles, self-determination, international law, collective security, yet he also possessed a rigid idealism that could blind him to practical realities. He saw America not merely as a nation but as a force for global reform. Across the Atlantic, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George was pragmatic, energetic, politically cunning. He understood the exhaustion of his country and the fragility of public morale. Victory was essential not only militarily but psychologically. In France, leaders faced an even harsher reality. Much of their country was occupied or devastated. Cities lay in ruins. Farms were created wastelands. French commanders carried the weight of defending their homeland inch by inch, knowing that retreat meant surrendering French soil. Germany's leadership presented a stark contrast. Real power lay not with civilian politicians but with the military high command generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. They were methodical, disciplined, and increasingly desperate. They believed Germany could still win through decisive action before American forces tipped the balance irreversibly. Ludendorff in particular embodied relentless will. He pushed for unrestricted submarine warfare despite warnings it would bring America into the conflict. He calculated that Britain could be starved into submission before American troops arrived in meaningful numbers. It was a gamble with continental stakes. Behind all these figures loomed a deeper psychological reality. None could easily stop the war without risking internal collapse. Publics had endured too much loss to accept anything short of victory. Leaders were trapped by their own rhetoric. The war had become self-perpetuating. America's entry did not mean immediate impact. The Atlantic Ocean remained a logistical barrier. Transporting an army across submarine-infested waters required an unprecedented coordination of shipping, naval escorts, training, and supply chains. The American Expeditionary Forces, under General John J. Pershing, faced a steep learning curve. The U.S. Army was small by European standards and inexperienced in modern industrial warfare. Pershing insisted American troops fight as an independent force rather than being absorbed into British or French units. He believed national identity and morale depended on it. Training camps sprang up across the United States. Millions of civilians became soldiers almost overnight. Factories converted to war production. Women entered industrial roles in massive numbers. Railroads operated under federal control to maximize efficiency. Meanwhile, German U-boats intensified their campaign. Convoys became lifelines. Every troop ship that reached Europe was a strategic victory. Every sinking a catastrophe. Geography also dictated strategy. The Western Front's trench system favored defenders. Breaking through required overwhelming artillery coordination between infantry and tanks, and critically fresh manpower willing to advance into machine gun fire. Deception and intelligence operations intensified. Both sides attempted to conceal troop movements, mislead aerial reconnaissance, and disrupt communications. Yet the sheer scale of forces involved made secrecy nearly impossible. By early 1918, American soldiers began arriving in numbers that could no longer be dismissed as symbolic. Germany understood the clock was ticking. March 21, 1918, 4:40 a.m. Western Front. The silence shattered. A hurricane of artillery erupted along a 50-mile front. Shells screamed overhead, detonating in trenches, command posts, supply depots. Gas rounds, followed chlorine and mustard rolling low across the ground like malevolent fog. This was Operation Michael, the opening phase of Germany's spring offensive. Ludendorff's last best chance to win before American strength became overwhelming. Stormtrooper units, elite infiltration forces moved behind the barrage. Unlike earlier tactics, they bypassed strongpoints, targeting communication hubs, artillery positions, and rear areas. The goal was not gradual advance but systemic collapse. British lines buckled under the assault. Units became isolated. Orders failed to reach the front. Entire sectors dissolved into chaos. Hour by hour, German forces pushed forward at a pace unseen since 1914. Prisoners streamed to the rear. Equipment was abandoned. Rumors spread faster than facts. By midday, commanders struggled to determine where their own lines existed. American units, still relatively new to the front, found themselves thrown into the maelstrom. Some held firm, Others experienced the shock of modern warfare for the first time. Artillery so intense it felt like the earth itself was disintegrating. Communication failures compounded the crisis. Telephone lines were cut. Messengers were killed en route. Signal flares misinterpreted. Decisions had to be made with incomplete information, yet the German advance carried a fatal weakness: logistics. Rapid movement outpaced supply lines. Artillery lagged behind. Food and ammunition dwindled. Exhausted troops encountered abandoned Allied stockpiles and paused to eat, drink, rest. Momentum slowed. Allied reserves, including increasing numbers of Americans, began plugging gaps. Defensive lines were formed in depth rather than collapsing outright. The turning point came not in a single dramatic clash but in the gradual realization that Germany could not sustain the offensive indefinitely. Every mile gained stretched their capacity further. Every delay allowed fresh Allied forces to arrive. By summer, the initiative had shifted. August 8, 1918, Amiens Allied forces launched a coordinated counteroffensive combining infantry, tanks, artillery and aircraft with unprecedented precision. German defenses, already strained, crumbled. Prisoners surrendered in droves. Ludendorff himself reportedly called it the Black Day of the German army. From that moment forward, retreat replaced advance. The aftermath was catastrophic. Between 1914 and 1918, the war claimed roughly 20 million lives, soldiers and civilians combined. Tens of millions more were wounded, maimed, or psychologically shattered. Entire regions of France and Belgium were reduced to uninhabitable wastelands. Politically, empires collapsed in rapid succession. The German Empire fell as revolution spread through its cities. Austria-Hungary fragmented into new nations. The Ottoman Empire disintegrated, its territories carved up by victorious powers. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns fell silent. For the first time in over 4 years, the Western Front knew quiet. The Treaty of Versailles would follow, imposing harsh reparations and territorial losses on Germany. Many contemporaries believed the terms ensured peace. Others warned they ensured resentment. Economically, Europe was devastated, infrastructure destroyed, debt astronomical, populations depleted. The United States emerged comparatively stronger, its homeland untouched, its industry expanded, its influence global. Yet the psychological damage was immeasurable. A generation had been traumatized. Faith in progress, reason, and civilization itself had been shaken. The critical mistake that sealed Germany's fate was not a single decision but a chain of miscalculations driven by urgency. Unrestricted submarine warfare brought America into the conflict, precisely the outcome German strategists had feared but hoped to avoid. The spring offensive, though tactically brilliant, exhausted Germany's last reserves without achieving decisive victory, and the failure to transition from breakthrough to sustainable advance turned success into attrition. Overconfidence played its part. So did desperation. Germany fought as if time were both enemy and weapon. In the end, time belonged to America. The legacy of America's entry into World War I reshaped the 20th century. It demonstrated the decisive power of industrial capacity combined with manpower. It elevated the United States to a central role in global affairs, ending its relative isolation. It accelerated military innovations, combined arms warfare, large-scale air operations, mechanization that would define future conflicts. Yet the peace proved fragile. The unresolved tensions, punitive settlements, and political upheavals created conditions that would ignite an even more destructive war 2 decades later. Modern parallels remain unsettling. Economic interdependence can coexist with geopolitical rivalry. Technological advancement can magnify rather than prevent destruction. Alliances can deter conflict or entangle nations in it. In 1917, Americans believed they were entering the war to end all wars. In 1918, the guns stopped, but the forces unleashed did not, because war is rarely an ending. It is more often an intermission. And in the silence that followed November 11th, beneath the shattered landscapes and mass graves, the 20th century was already preparing its next catastrophe, waiting for new leaders, new grievances, and new young men who believed history would be different this time. It never is.